Hello, and welcome to Hopeful Conversations brought to you by Robbie's Hope Foundation. I am your host, Kari Eckert. Joining me today is Dr. Charles Smith, the Regional Administrator at SAMHSA, otherwise known as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse, and Mental Health Services Administration. Dr. Smith is a representative of the Assistant Secretary and the lead federal authority for mental health and substance use, and works to advance the behavioral health system of care. He is also a father. Dr. Smith, thank you for joining us and welcome to Hopeful Conversations.
Thank you very much. And wonderful to be here with you.
We'll just go ahead and get started. Can you talk us through how mental health within teens can lead to substance use and in turn lead to substance abuse?
Sure, I'm more than happy to this is a really difficult and tricky conversation. It's really complex and it impacts all of us very, very differently. Clearly, how we feel about ourselves, our emotional health and well-being has a direct impact on how we see the world, how our physical health is doing, how we interact with our friends, school, family, and that is so important with regard to giving us foundation, really emphasizing the importance of emotional and mental health alongside our physical health and social health. Clearly, there's a strong interaction when we're not feeling well, emotionally if we're not feeling well. Drugs, alcohol, and any other thing that might help us change that feeling, we're oftentimes attracted to. And clearly, alcohol, tobacco, illicit drugs, and yes, in some states now, cannabis are very available to help us change that feeling, whether it's feeling sad or not very good, or actually feeling really good, and you actually want to add to that feeling of wellness and excitement. But there is this relationship that we have as a society to actually find ways to alter how we feel. Clearly, when we're struggling and we're feeling very sad and even depressed, alcohol, drugs, other mind-altering substances are really an immediate benefit. And that's where we can actually start using to change that feeling. But oftentimes it's short-lived. And we then end up losing that good feeling and oftentimes have to repeat it because we're actually falling back into not feeling great. And we want to find a way in which we can actually continue that feeling of avoidance, that feeling of not as sad or not as depressed or feeling more regulated and connected. But that's typically dependent on when we're using something. That's that transition. And again, it doesn't happen immediately. It happens over time. There are a multitude of factors that influence it. But over time, if we are finding that we're feeding our emotions or feeding when we're not feeling too well with alcohol and nicotine and other drugs, that's when we can actually transition from using a substance and using it to a place where we are, quote unquote, abusing it or misusing it in a chronic way. And when it becomes chronic and we start misusing it more frequently, that's when we can actually start seeing some of the negative sides of that use, which oftentimes mimic the negative sides of not feeling emotionally great. So we end up kind of disconnecting or isolating from our friends and family. We may be having troubles with school. We may be having trouble in sports and some of the other extracurricular activities that we have always found joy with. And that can be a combination of not only how we're emotionally doing, but also how we may be doing with regard to using substances to try to get away from that emotional negative feeling. And then we have a combination of the two, and it starts really getting difficult to discern or mucky. But now we're in this spiral where one issue is feeding the other. So
Very complex.
It's fairly complicated, yeah.
Very complex, and then kind of entering that cycle of downward spiral, how dangerous that can be, particularly for young people. Tough stuff. So how does the introduction of substances to a teen typically result in abuse of these substances?
Well, I don't know if it's necessary. There's a typical way, because I think everyone kind of finds their own path towards kind of using and connecting to illicit substances. One of the things that we frequently believe as a society is that once we're an adolescent or young adult, most of us are using substances and alcohol, and it's actually just the opposite. There's actually fewer than 50% of individuals are in high school and in middle school are actually using alcohol and other drugs on a regular basis.
I've heard that statistic a lot, that it's very much over-reported. People think that a lot more young people are using than actually are.
Exactly. And so when we look at some of the U.S. rates for those individuals who are between the ages of 12 and 17, only about 7% of the U.S. population are using alcohol at least once in the past year. And
that's decreasing over time?
What? Pardon me?
Has that been a decreasing statistic, the use of alcohol? Was it higher back 20 years ago?
It's actually not. It's actually been holding steady. And one of the things we're seeing, and now this is specifically alcohol, and if we look at Colorado, it's around 9% of that 12 to 17 year old age range. But then when we look at cannabis or marijuana, we know that it's around 4% of the U.S. population are using marijuana at least once in the past year. And in Colorado, it's around 7%. And part of that is Colorado looks a little bit differently, but that still means that 93% are not using. But we tend to kind of focus on some of the statistics that focus on those who are only using when that is not the norm.
Right.
That being said, I think there are a variety of different things that contribute to why we end up using, trying, experimenting with alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, including cannabis that may be illegal or legal. And I definitely want to talk about prescription medication as well, and that all of those things are available to us, regardless of the rules. I think part of it in our laws and society, but at the same time, peer pressure plays a role, access plays a role, and very much how parents play a role with kids in their decision about using alcohol and drugs. One thing that we do know is that kids between the ages of 12 and 18 will listen to their parents and make decisions when their parents have open communication about alcohol and drugs in a favorable way. So they're less likely to use, as opposed to those 12 to 18-year-olds who may not have those conversations with parents.
A favorable way. What, in your opinion, does a favorable conversation?
A favorable way is having open conversations and not to be kind of stigmatizing and or making a teen feel uncomfortable with their use or potential use, or feeling and having straight up conversations as a parent to say, I'm concerned about your health. And when you use alcohol and drugs, you actually are impacting your health. Even though some of your friends and some of the media may be saying this is healthy for you, we know that that's really not the case, particularly as 12 to 18-year-olds are still developing and they're still kind of growing. And anything that we are doing with regard to impacting our health and wellness can have long-term effects. And so having those open conversations as parents, as trusted advisors within our teens' life can make a big difference on the decisions that we make.
We use that word trust a lot. We're talking about suicide prevention, a trusted adult, and sometimes that it isn't just your parent. Parents
Correct.
often think that it is just them, and statistics will show you that oftentimes you are, as a parent, are not the trusted adult. But having an open conversation with your child, who is your trusted adult, who would you go to, and then we so often hear from teens about all of these conversations, whether it be suicide prevention, whether it be substance use, alcohol, marijuana, whatever it is, it's about trust. Trust. And sometimes I think just parents, it's hard to bring that to the table. We're so concerned about the health of our children, the safety of our children. And we were teenagers once too, that sometimes it's just hard to trust one another. But that's what teens are looking for, is that trust element.
Yeah. And Kari, I'm frequently reminded, and I spent lots of time talking with my kids about, my trusted advisors were people who are teachers and athletic coaches. And they were the people that I went to first, in part because the relationship was a little bit less intense, and I felt as though I'd be less scrutinized than owning up to mom and dad. But to find those people who you could actually lean on is really important.
Yeah. Coaches in the state of Colorado are getting a lot more training to be open to these conversations, which we're really, really grateful for, because young people do trust them in teachers. I hope that we can get more funding to educate our teachers about these conversations. So we put a lot on our teachers' plates, and sometimes the dollars just and the time of the hours in the day aren't there for them for all that we expect them to do. But people go into coaching, teaching, medicine because they care about people. Yeah. So in your experience working with teens, what do signs and symptoms of substance abuse typically look like? There's that word again, typical, and I know that's a tough one, but what can substance abuse look like for a teen?
Well, it looks differently for every teen. Clearly, if somebody is using alcohol, drugs, and to some degree nicotine, there are going to be changes in behavior. Part of that may be really mild changes. Some of that may be kind of what we typically see when we're not feeling emotionally and or physically well as well. We oftentimes disengage from those friendship groups, those individuals that we've engaged with for a long time. There may be isolation when it comes to with family and or work and or school. There can be changes when it comes to school performance. There can be changes with regard to musical performance and athletic performance and other types of activities. Changes in schedules, their attention to their faith when it may have been very much part of their personhood before starting to use, that may change over a period of time. And then clearly, when it comes to alcohol and other drugs, it may then be demonstrated through some indiscriminate, more risky behavior, which could be driving, which could be actually using during school or during other types of activities that include social activities beyond the typical party, but really placing that individual and potentially others at risk. And clearly, those are kind of graduating levels of evidence where there may be concern. And I think that at any point, if any of the listeners to the podcast kind of have any concerns about their friends, about loved ones, it's an opportunity to ask those questions and check in, communicate your concern and love and appreciation for your friends, and let them know that you're concerned about them, including.
What could be an example of a question that somebody could use if they were concerned about a young person?
Yeah, I think it can be as simple as, I think I'm seeing some things are changing. Are you doing okay? I'm worried about you. Mm-hmm. Reinforcing the fact that you are there for them if they want to kind of talk and have an outlet. And I think one of the things that we typically, and it's not just teens, it's not just young adults, but it's also adults. We tend to not to ask these questions because we feel somehow we're going to make it worse. And actually, that's a myth. We actually are not going to make it worse if we ask about alcohol use, illicit drug use, or how we're doing emotionally. And I think even asking about suicide or thoughts of suicide, those are things that are important to ask, and you're not going to cause anything. It's not going to result.
Thank you that's such a big myth in suicide prevention, that if you ask the question that you're planting the seed, and research absolutely shows the opposite of that, right. If you're concerned about somebody, and you ask the question directly, looking for them to answer honestly, that you're showing them that you care.
Exactly.
Giving them an opportunity to say, yeah, I'm struggling. And whether that is using that same approach to substance abuse or substance use, not abuse. I guess we can't always assume that it's abuse. It's just for young people, we want to talk about use as well.
Yeah. And actually, one of the things I want to emphasize is even in our industry, we're not using the word abuse anymore.
Okay.
In that that can be derogatory. But it's oftentimes substance use or misuse, because we don't want to necessarily label misuse as somehow socially bad. It's an indication that it's getting out of control, and that's health related, and that's a health concern that we want to kind of bring to the attention of the individual, because we don't want to talk about health concerns as if they're abusive or that we are self-abusing. It's much more we're misusing, and we're getting to a place where we're actually threatening our own health, and that's because we're misusing. And so I think that might be a nice kind of small language reframe that can be helpful, I think, in conversation.
I think it's very helpful. I find language so important. It can be so triggering in the world of suicide prevention. A lot of people still use the word commit, and I very much avoid that word. I probably used it prior to my son's death, but commit is something we associate with a crime or a sin. And my son did not commit a crime or a sin. My son died of probably an undiagnosed mental illness, whether that was acute or chronic. Language is so important. That's one of the things I love working about with teens is they are so in tune to using the right language, and it's so important to them. And just the dialogue that they bring to the conversation is, in all of these issues, is just, it's such a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think you mentioned this just a tiny bit, but I maybe digging a little bit deeper. Things like peer pressure, social expectations, and norms. How do they affect the introduction or early stages of substance use?
Clearly, it speaks to really this complicated relationship that we as people, and particularly for adolescents, young adults, are trying to kind of dance this really complicated dance with all these influences and elements to the dance. And clearly peers and friendship groups and the pressure of being included versus excluded have an enormous toll on our emotions and our feelings of inclusion and wanting to be wanted and befriended and engaged. And in some cases, alcohol, drugs, the idea of going to a party, these things become part of that social norm. But again, I want to emphasize it's not all social norm. It's not all norms. And so I think it's kind of finding clearly those groups of trusted individuals, people that you actually feel as though they're your people, that subscribe to your same kind of beliefs and ideologies and wants and desires, and to find that degree of comfort. But that takes time and experimentation. I think in those places, there may be exposure to drugs and alcohol, and it ends up being really a difficult space to, one, say no, or to hold off on that either temptation and or the pressure to actually be part of the group to actually then engage in using, because there's the belief that somehow if you use that, you'll then be accepted. And these are where these critical conversations, whether it's with trusted adults, trusted friends, parents, others, to have those conversations. Well, if I go to a party, how do I say no? And if I say no to using, is that somehow going to exclude me from something that I may want or be in the group that I want to be with? And clearly those are decisions that we all have to make. But they're really intense when we're young. It's not to say that they're not intense when we get older either, because I think those pressures are oftentimes still there. But hopefully over the course of time, we get to be a little bit more fluent in how we want to handle and what we want and how we want to communicate. But there's a lot of these type of pressures. And then on top of that, there's this construct of really understanding and recognizing when we get bullied or pressured, when we're made to feel very ashamed of who we are, should we choose not to do something that a group wants us to do. And clearly, again, being supportive to each other, having outlets by which friends can talk to friends, individuals can talk to trusted advisors and adults, because that should never happen, no matter what the situation. And while bullying can take place, it oftentimes hits us close to home, and then we're now at a place where we are uncomfortable and may then seek comfort through other things that change how we feel. And drugs and alcohol are part of that. So again, it goes back to this really complicated dance that we end up having to be in. But know that you're not alone. I think that's the big thing in any one of these situations. You're never alone.
Your answer sounds very similar to the conversations that I had with my parents when I was 16, 17 years old, going to parties, getting prepared to go away to college and have more options, being able to, or having to make more decisions on my own. I guess I'm just trying to say historically, it sounds pretty much the same. I'm wondering, with your experience, if social media now for young people, for like that 12 to 18-year-old group, is changing some of these peer expectations, these peer norms with the relationship to substances.
Well, clearly, social media, as we now know it, wasn't there when you and I were growing up, and did not have the same influences as it does now on growing up and kind of being part of groups and experiences. And you mentioned earlier about the importance of coaching and coaches kind of getting familiar with mental health and substance use. So I've actually been a high school baseball coach here in Colorado for the last 5 years, and I've gone through a lot of those trainings. But the point I wanted to make was, when I first started coaching around 20 years ago, there wasn't cell phones, and now there's cell phones. There wasn't kind of the same type of connection that teens made and kept and created throughout the school day that was like the way it was 20 years ago and 30 years ago. Clearly, those type of media plays a big role in how we connect, how we communicate. And oftentimes those mediums for communication, whether it's social media, whether it's phone, text, video, chat, so forth, can be influential in how we develop and maintain social connections, how we find trusted advisors and trusted people, and where we get information about what is socially acceptable and really kind of finding our way between what is socially acceptable versus what I want, what I believe in, what I see as my purpose and my core, which is still developing and doesn't really end even after you go to college and well after that. You're still developing those. But I think social media plays a big role in that. And I think that's frequently talked about. It's okay to turn off every now and then and kind of reset and come back, and at the same time check in and make sure that you're reading this correctly, rather than caught up into a communication loop and or string that may not be as healthy in the content of that communication and how it impacts you as well as what you're contributing to it.
We certainly didn't have phones back. I'm turning 50 this year, so and just like the information part that is just so interesting. How I was just reading an article, like that is the source of information and we say it's only for kids, only for young people, but plenty of adults, that's where we're getting our information, even like sources like Instagram. So I just, it's a different day for certain.
Well, one thing I will add is that my agency, SAMHSA, is funding a national center on the impact of social media on mental health and substance use starting this next month.
Oh, good.
There will be a national center of excellence that will be making available a lot of information and research as well as strategies for individuals, for families, for parents, for teens and young adults, and how to kind of really manage that nuance, that new environment and new medium, since we see it's tremendously important.
I look forward to that. I was looking at the website of SAMHSA. It's such a good resource. Under that public messages tab, there's just a ton of really, really good articles for individuals, young and old, parents, and for young people to use as a resource. So we need more research, but you guys have a lot of great research already, and I would very much direct people to your website. So when someone is struggling with a substance, how are others' lives, like family, friends, and other significant people, affected by another person's use?
Very affected. I think that, anytime that, our behavior is kind of like, I frequently talk about it, when you drop a pebble into a pond, you create a ripple. And if we think about each one of us as a pebble, we're causing a ripple throughout our personal kind of ecosystem, which includes family and friends and parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, including teachers and other friends and so forth. And so that pebble that we are, anytime we change our behavior, whether that's using or misusing substances, alcohol, even tobacco, and other illicit substances, including marijuana, that impacts how we feel and how we interact with all those parts of our ecosystem, how we talk, how we engage, and people as a result of that are going to counter-react to our behavior. And so that kind of pebble has always been kind of my way of kind of recognizing we are constantly dropping that pebble, us being that pebble. And as I would tell my kids who are now 22 and 24, is that as a family, we'd be dropping 4 pebbles into the pond at the same time. And so that those interactions are constantly impacting each other back and forth. And so my pebble is going to impact my daughter, and my daughter's pebble is going to impact me, and constantly being able to kind of work back and forth on that. And part of that is emotional, part of that is reactive. We end up having different roles that play out. You know, the parent role versus the child role, the brother role versus the sister role, and being able to kind of really see how those interactions are impacted. And when you add alcohol or drugs, that ends up changing the behaviors, the communication, the sense of trust and safety that exists within those units.
The pebble effect and the ripple effect, and how when we're doing good things, making good choices, how that can ripple into our community, our family, our friends as well. What does substance use or like treatment for a teenager look like for somebody that just, is concerned about their child or concerned about a friend? What kind of steps there can you walk us through?
Yeah, there's a whole therapeutic system for mental health as well as substance use. And in many ways, as I frequently talk about it, it mirrors what, particularly for young people, have been going through in the sense of receiving from their pediatrician. And then if you need a specialist, the pediatrician would refer you to a specialist. And I think one of the things that's been really quite remarkable is my agency, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has been working very closely with the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Okay.
One, highlight the importance of screening for substance use, as well as mental health, to include emotional health and depression and suicide, as part of the standard healthcare practice. One of the things I frequently talk about is when my kids turned 14, they were asked questions by their pediatricians concerning alcohol use and nicotine use and illicit drug use, as well as how they were feeling. Those were questions that I was never asked when I was their age. And I think that is an important change in our healthcare system that I really see as important going forward, because all of you now have that expectation to get that level of care and inquiry, just like you get height and weight and blood pressure. You're asked about your alcohol use, your drug use, your emotions.
Making those questions normalized. I don't mean to interrupt, but making them I remember as a female, 20 years ago, being asked potentially questions about abuse. And I remember at the first few times on annual exams, how foreign that was. What am I displaying that would make you want to ask me that I'm being abused by my spouse? It was just and then that question became routine, and I became familiar with it, and it was normalized. Robbie's Hope, actually, we, in 2019, I was able to work with the state of Colorado for high school exams that you have, high school physicals for sports that you have to mandatory have, that Colorado CHASA requires, but making part of that physical have a mental health evaluation, because research shows that people who die by suicide, 80% of them saw their physician within 6 months prior to their death. Right. And a question from a physician especially for a young person, holds weight, and they know that that question is important. So for substance use and for mental health, I'm just normalizing it, not making it foreign. So I interrupted you, but
no. That's and I just want to say I think that is so critical to the conversations that we have, our sense of comfort, and the fact that it's okay. This is part of life, and it's okay to have these conversations. But I think that first piece of screening is really important because clearly, whether someone knows that they're misusing and they're concerned about their health, or they may not know, just answering some of those questions, even with a pediatrician, can be helpful to identify a potential problem. Many of our pediatric offices are not set up to actually have specialists in mental health or substance use in those settings. And so there are a variety throughout the state of Colorado, as well as across the country, a number of adolescent-specific substance use treatment programs, most of which are outpatient-based. It's not that if you're struggling with a substance that you're going to be placed in a residential treatment facility and you're going to be there for 30 days before you come back. That's not the majority of treatment that's out there. We also know that for some individuals, their struggles with alcohol and drugs may actually start with getting picked up for a DUI or having some type of problem in school, where there is a judicial process where a recommendation may be from a judge, a municipal judge, to say, really want to recommend you actually be evaluated for a substance use disorder, and here's a place to go. And so there's another avenue to go in addition to your general health care provider. But it's, again, the majority of treatment is outpatient based. Just like if you had sprained your knee, you're not going to be in the hospital for an extended period of time. Okay. For individuals who have a significant addiction, where their ability to stop using is very, very difficult, and or they're causing a lot of problems with school, with their general health, with their social, a high level of treatment may be needed. That's different than outpatient. Just like if my diabetes got so out of control, I couldn't walk, I couldn't take care of myself, I may need to be hospitalized. But again, that's a very, very rare or infrequent situation for that level of care. But there are a variety of treatment programs throughout the entire state. You can actually go to the Colorado Behavioral Health Authority website to identify all of the different provider types in the state of Colorado. In addition, you can go to SAMHSA's website, www.samhsa.gov, and we have a behavioral health treatment locator for the entire country where you can type in your address and it will bring up specifically the drug and alcohol as well as mental health treatment programs in your community. And then you can even filter by age as well as insurance type. And that's available, most comprehensive in the entire country is through our website, and that's available to anybody.
Wow. Thank you for sharing such important resources for individuals. I guess I have two follow-up questions. Sure. Is there a high demand for these services like we hear at Children's Hospital, and I get phone calls quite frequently for mental health treatment for young people, that it's very, very difficult to find treatment and that the wait time is very is difficult. Is that true in substance use for you?
It is. I mean, there is, quite honestly, a healthcare crisis. And as much as working as a psychologist in Colorado for almost 30 years now, we know it's a crisis when it comes to mental health and substance use in Colorado. It doesn't mean that there's not resources. It does not mean that there's not excellent, high-quality care around the state and within each of the counties. We just know we need more. And there are, again, a variety of different points of contact, which definitely know your insurance, definitely know the types of resources and services you may need. The schools system in Colorado has really advanced its knowledge and responsiveness to providing mental health and substance use programs. A lot of school programs are now actually, with some federal dollars, providing integrated mental health and substance use treatment and services through many of the primary care centers that are developing relationships with each other. And so it is growing, but clearly demand is still there. So to answer your question, yes, it's still there.
Okay, now I have one more question that you mentioned that I was like, oh, okay. But first, last question is there a typical age that a young person, or a typical age for a disorder in substance use that, like 80% of people, like it's 80% of people with a mental health disorder, it's like before the age of 13, but most people wait 8 to 10 years to seek treatment with a diagnosable condition in mental health. Is there those types of statistics for substance use for an age, or is that not true?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's going to be very, very dependent on, obviously, exposures, a number of other factors. But this is what I will say. If a teen chooses not to drink alcohol before the age of 18, they're 75% less likely to develop a substance use disorder after the age of 25.
Nice.
If a teen chooses not to use substances or alcohol up until the age of 22, they're 99% not likely to develop a substance use disorder later in life. In other words, the earlier that we as humans are exposed to using substances, alcohol, tobacco, and illicit drugs, the earlier we choose to use them, the greater likelihood we have in developing patterns of misuse that can threaten our health and well-being. And so I think that probably is a more powerful statement.
It's very powerful.
So the more that we delay, the better off we're going to be. And we're going to be much more healthy in the long run. And that actually came from a huge piece of work done by Kaiser, tracking over 19,000 individuals from around the age of 10 to 12 all the way through adulthood, and actually finding these adverse childhood experiences and their impact in healthcare. Yes. So it was one of the most comprehensive longitudinal studies that really speaks to early indication and early exposure to certain things have impact later in life. Substances are one of them.
Delay.
Now, one thing I do want to kind of push out to your audience, on SAMHSA's website, some of the things I've been talking about is actually directly part of our national campaign called Talk, They Will Hear You. Okay. It's in multiple language. It provides examples and vignettes about how peers can talk to peers about mental health and substance use, how parents can talk to teens and young adults about substance use and mental health. And there's a whole host of different types of strategies and data to support those strategies, some of which I've been talking about today, but it's all on our website in this campaign with a lot of literature behind it called Talk, They Hear You.
Talk, They Hear You on the SAMHSA's website.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. I have a question for you. Just because a lot of young people listen to our podcast, and Sure. You have been working in the field for, you said, close to 30 years or over 30 years. Yep. If people are interested, a lot of young people are very empathetic and care. They say they want to go into some type of, healthcare field, helping others. What's your advice, or what's your take on that?
I think it's an absolutely dynamite profession, and there's a lot of different directories and pathways that you can take. Actually, SAMHSA, myself and a couple of my colleagues here in Denver, helped the Colorado Department of Education and the Department of Labor to establish a website called My Colorado Journey that you can actually see the ladder for all the different professions in mental health and substance use.
Really? My Colorado Journey.
My Colorado Journey, and there's a behavioral health ladder. There's a number of different professional ladders. In addition, you may want to check out in your school whether you have a chapter for the Health Occupation Student Association. Many of your schools probably have business chapters called DECA.
Yes.
HOSA is the health professions chapter. I believe there's around 2,400 students in Colorado that are members of HOSA. Part of that is a huge pathway to exposure to the field of mental health and substance use. And I'm one of the board members of the Colorado HOSA chapter, as well as SAMHSA's funding scholarships to actually connected to the field of mental health and substance use. And then there's opportunities to kind of get a lot of exposure to see the different kind of direction, either as a peer provider or working to become a social worker, a licensed addiction counselor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and you can have all of these different kind of opportunities to see and feel how these professions truly operate and to put your passion and interest in that potential professional direction.
Awesome. I'm so glad I asked that question. I have my undergrad is in psychology, and I will tell you, as a college student 25 years ago, I didn't know what I was even going to be able to do with psychology back then. And I just providing young people, I think, opportunities and exposure to what is out there is so helpful.
Yep.
Okay. We always end our podcast with the same question, and you can answer this as any direction you would like, but what does the world need to hear right now?
The world needs hope. And I think the message of hope is that we're all here, we're all human beings, and the hope is for a better, healthier future.
I very much agree that we all need hope. That is certainly part of our name that I chose 4 years ago, not really knowing what it meant. And I learned directly that hope, and a lot of people in the world of mental health, means to hold on. Pain ends, that we will be able to get through this. Thank you, Dr. Smith, so much for joining me today on a hopeful conversation. Be sure, listeners, to tune in to our next episode. Until then, remember, hold on, pain ends.